Today we're going to be looking at some of the iconic games that have completely changed what we understand to be the gaming world today. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Mouse Hole with me on AnyMouse. Today we're going to try something a little bit different and we're going to have a look at some of the games over the years that have introduced really innovative mechanics that have completely changed the gaming scene. There's a huge breadth of games out there obviously, and there are a number of really seminal moments when things have changed. And the first of those comes, and I couldn't believe actually when this was when I started looking it up, because I remember it well. The first of all these properly commercial games, and the first one I recall, was Pong back in 1972. 1972, really. I had no idea it was that early. I was thinking late 70s, possibly even early 80s. But no, that's when Pong came about on the Atari. The Atari was the first real game console, and it used cartridges that were inserted into it on which the games were stored. It had a couple of different controllers with it. I remember there being a joystick, and I think there was another controller as well. I can't for the life of me remember what that one was like. But the Atari was a great system and it was really functional. It plugged into a normal TV, and Pong, which is in effect an online version of tennis, was the first game that they brought out for it. And it was really groundbreaking. As you can see, it's sometimes not that easy to hit the ball as it comes towards you, especially when it's coming at an angle, and that kind of made it quite a good tactic to figure out how to make the ball go at an angle, and you can see some examples of it in the little bit of footage that we've got. Pong was a real groundbreaker, black and white, 2 players, and very simple graphic with not an awful lot going on to complicate it, but then there wouldn't be, because the Atari 2600 actually had only 128 bytes of RAM. Can you imagine that? 128 bytes. That was a pitiful, limited amount of memory to run anything in. And of course that didn't come about until 1977. The original game actually launched in an arcade form factor in a machine, a coin-operated machine. And it wasn't, as I say, until 77 that the actual Atari version came out. But Pong was it was an extraordinary thing to be able to play computer games at home. This was, of course, closely followed in 1978 by the absolute iconic Space Invaders. As a kid who grew up in the 70s and 80s, the advent of Space Invaders was just extraordinary, and various different, slightly different varieties on the theme came about over the succeeding few years. But nothing really beat the originality of the first Space Invaders game, which was an incredible amount of fun and pretty challenging as you got towards the end of a level and the enemies coming down towards you started getting faster and faster. And of course, all those extra points for getting the little flying saucer that went across the top were pretty impossible until you got rid of some of the enemies at the start. Space Invaders is timeless and people still play it today, and I certainly would like to, and you know what, I haven't thought about it for a while. I'll maybe just give that a go. Moving on from Space Invaders, but not that far, we come to actually what was the most successful game ever for Atari whilst they were still around. In 1980 they launched Pac-Man, and Pac-Man had again been in a form factor that was used in arcades, in coin-operated machines, and it was in pubs on things that were kind of like a table. And Pac-Man really kind of changed the genre, because it allowed for the first time the player to start taking actions that affected what was going on in the game. For example, by swallowing those 4 pills round the corner of the screen and changing the enemies such that they turned into something that could be gobbled up, along with all the little breadcrumbs that were spread around the rest of the map. And the other thing that it did was allowed you to exit from one side of the map and appear on the other, which was really handy in gameplay, but was pretty innovative. That was something that it did appear in other games, but for its time and for the hardware that it was operating on, Pac-Man was just extraordinary. We then come to something else that was a mainstay of the 80s. In 1981, we suddenly got the introduction of Donkey Kong. And Donkey Kong, again, was a bit of a game changer. It introduced, I believe it was 4 levels in the original game, and those became not just a little bit harder, but a little bit different as you progressed through the levels. But what it introduced was a bit of a narrative. There was an objective for the player to achieve. The protagonist going in and rescuing Pauline, as she was called, the heroine at the top of the screen, from the gorilla, and there was a real sense of satisfaction in getting to the top of those maps, which of course was closely followed by moving on to the next level and quite often not getting very far before getting hit on the head by one of those barrels as they came down. But I remember hours and hours of fun playing with Donkey Kong and its very first attempt at storytelling. One of the games that I absolutely loved and started me on a path which I'm still on today came out in 1983. And that was David Braben and Ian Bell's Elite. Working with the 32K of RAM that was in the BBC Micro and later on the ZX Spectrum, Elite broke ground in so many ways, being able to cram, in effect, a galaxy, albeit a small one, into the memory space of 32K was nothing short of extraordinary. And the polygon-esque ships that were used to build it were a function of that, because there was no opportunity to do anything else. And of course graphics were limited as well. But besides the concept of a whole space system to be able to stretch that 3D free travel instinct into, the other thing that I particularly recall about Elite, and the thing that has been now a component of all sorts of games and still is, was the idea of an entire economy. And Elite took this to not just new levels, but it did extraordinary things by allowing you to trade between the various locations within the system, and to, via that, to be able to upgrade your ship and move from being harmless, which was where we started out, based on the Douglas Adams novels who were around at the time, to become the elite of the universe. And that goes on today with Elite Dangerous, which, in my personal view, has kind of lost its way a little bit at the moment, but again was extraordinary when it came out. And it's great to see that that kind of game was actually funded by the community who had lived the game and had such a fantastic time generating their own space trading system throughout the galaxy. We then come to 1986 and the release of a game that I actually didn't play at the time, and Shigeru Miyamoto's The Legend of Zelda. This was a hugely popular game and went through a number of iterations, and it really started to create the concept of open world exploration games, letting players actually choose where they were going to go and find things that were hidden around the map. And that was a real breakthrough, because up until then everything had been a bit storyboard, and it had been start at point A, move to point B, move to point C, whereas Zelda kind of changed that. Zelda gave you the option and the opportunity to do what you wanted to do, and this was absolutely groundbreaking and a lot of fun for the people who played with Zelda at the time. We then move on to 1990, when we saw the first in a whole series of games and spin-offs that came as a consequence of the direct success of Command and Conquer. Command and Conquer was a fantastic game and so different compared to things that had come before. It was the first kind of base building game, but one of the things that really made it stand out was the inclusion in the game of actual video excerpts that were played to the player. And those took the form of instructions from the high command, if you like, giving us the objectives for each of the levels within the game. And those levels were increasingly challenging, with less and less of the resource that we had to collect, which, if I remember correctly, was called Tiberium. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. And with more and more complex types of buildings that we could build within the base, and fences and walls and things like that, and of course combat units that we could use to both defend the base and go and take down the enemy base if we could find it on the map. And I remember playing Command and Conquer and Tiberian Sun and some of the other versions of it, and being absolutely astounded by just what was becoming possible in a vastly expanding field of computer games. We then come on to 1996, when quite a lot started happening. The first of the games to come out in 96 that really changed things was kind of a knock-on from Donkey Kong, and that was Super Mario. It took a similar character, or the same character, and it turned the platforming that was 2D within Donkey Kong into a 3D platforming mission type game, and that opened up absolute masses of possibilities for what we could do. In effect, you could explore really freely in a 3D environment, and that was something that no one had effectively done before. The design, the levels themselves were really, really innovative in the way that they were designed. And one of the things that was extraordinary about Super Mario was that you could actually choose your own camera angles and vary how you were looking at the character. And that was the first time that had happened as well. So this was real groundbreaking stuff, and anyone who was around at the time will know that it sparked a whole host of copycats and sequels which developed upon that gameplay. In the same year, but in a completely different manner, we saw Tomb Raider for the first time come around and do the same thing. There are a number of things that I recall being stunned by in Tomb Raider. The graphics were developing and starting to turn into something really interesting. What I remember about Tomb Raider was, first of all, we had Lara Croft, the first female protagonist that we had in the game, but also this swashbuckling character who would go out and tackle all sorts of puzzles. And that was the thing that I really, really remember about Tomb Raider, was the really interesting and sometimes quite challenging puzzles that you had to work out in order to be able to get to where you had to get to and to defeat the enemies you had to defeat. There were also things like how Lara aimed her gun automatically towards the enemies. This was the start of some real intelligence getting into the gaming systems. And of course, it again created a whole new genre and was quite a phenomenon in its time. I even have a niece called Lara who was literally named after Lara Croft in Tomb Raider because both her parents absolutely loved the game. Moving forward a couple of years, we come to 1998 and we get to Metal Gear Solid. This is another game that I didn't really play at the time. However, the thing that Metal Gear, apart from, again, vastly improved graphics, which is a pattern we'll see as we go through this, the thing that Metal Gear Solid really introduced that was a complete new direction for gaming was the introduction of stealth mechanics. How you could start to introduce some strategy into how you were playing your game rather than just charging in guns blazing, which of course some of us still do from time to time. But we could start with Metal Gear Solid to actually begin to try and work out what was the way that we could get in without setting off all the alarms, without triggering all the enemies. I remember Commandos being something around about the same era that you could do something very, very similar on. And of course that was carried on in the next game we're going to come to, which was again only a couple of years later in the year 2000, and that was Deus Ex. And I remember Deus Ex really vividly. And it was, again, taking what was there in Zelda and taking open-endedness within gameplay to a whole new level. And the one thing that it really excelled at was it didn't pigeonhole you into following a breadcrumb trail again to get to your objective. You could go around that map however you wanted, and of course you could develop the character however you wanted. It's the first time I recall of having a huge range of different weapons and upgrades and things like that all changed how your character worked. And of course within that there was a stealth component as well. And Deus Ex was a really, really immersive game with mechanics that were just completely unknown for its time. And taking that a step further forward in the same year, we have The Sims. The Sims, again, has clearly spawned a whole host of sequels and alternatives, but this was an extraordinary situation where for the first time we could actually start to simulate life and how characters would build. And this is the groundbreaking moment for all of the simulation games that came after that. City simulators and farm simulators and all of these things are based on that same concept that came around with The Sims in the year 2000. And the level to which we could control not just the map in general but the entire cast of characters that was there was just extraordinary, and it opened the door to all sorts of new things going on within the gaming industry. And that of course led us just the following year to goings on that I don't think anyone had predicted. And these came about actually in the city that I grew up in. And there's a reason why that happened. I grew up in Dundee in Scotland, and Dundee is still now one of the 2 or 3 major centres for gaming programmers in the world. And the reason that came about was because in 1980-81 there was the first ever home computer released on the market, certainly within the UK, by the Sinclair Corporation, by Clive Sinclair, and that was the ZX80, ZX81. And I had one of those. And what that did was that spawned a whole generation who started computing for the first time at an early age. And these are the people who, when they got to their late teens and their early 20s, then started programming the next lot of games with that knowledge that they'd accumulated over those years. And one of the ones to benefit from that, and it was actually started in Dundee again, was Grand Theft Auto, one of the most successful individual games and genres there's ever been. Once again, it's something that was completely groundbreaking and took the 3D free to travel concept and turned it into something just orders of magnitude above what it had been before, where we could be good, bad or indifferent and get ourselves into all sorts of scrape and bother and interesting situations with all sorts of different modalities. It was really a tremendous step forward and something that clearly is still going today. 20 years later in different iterations. Something that came just a little bit after that, but again was completely different from what went before, and actually since I've never seen anything that really reproduced what they did, is Portal. And the concept of Portal is such a simple one. We put a destination portal in one place with his magic gun in our hands, and then we put the starting point portal in another place. We walk into that and we appear out of the destination one. This kind of takes what started with Pac-Man, with being able to go out one side of the map and appear on the other side of the map, to a completely different level. And the puzzles that were created that we had to figure out within Portal were just extraordinary. It was a very, very clever game that really was nothing like anything that I can think of before or since. I don't think it was one of the biggest games ever, but it certainly was one of the most innovative and was famed for its completely mind-bending puzzles that would confound you until they seemed, of course, completely obvious. We then come to one of the, if not in fact, I think the biggest game of all time. At number 15, we have Minecraft. And Minecraft these days is less of a game and more of a phenomenon. As something that started with super limited graphics, super pixely tools and maps and everything within it, such a simple concept became extraordinarily complicated. I remember people building not just things like great big mansions, but working spinning drive hard disk drives and all sorts of things. People would build absolutely anything, and still do, in Minecraft. And of course it has evolved as well over the years, using the same concept. And it's really, I really like that it's kept to its core values and its core strengths. And here we are in 2023, and Minecraft is still not just growing strong, but is still one of the biggest games on the planet. Given that it was launched in 2011, we've now spanned a period of 30 years all the way back to Pong, and going from 128 bytes of RAM to the multi-tens of gigabytes and above that we're now capable of in modern day systems. The capabilities of graphics have obviously evolved immensely, as has everything else to do with computing. But I hope you've enjoyed that little reminiscence down the alley of games over the last 30 years. I'm going to be looking into some other aspects of gaming, and particularly historical ones, and some of the real developments, other developments we've seen over the coming weeks. So If you'd like to see those, please subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and if there's anything that you think I missed in relation to those games, please drop a comment below and let me know what your favourite games were. What did I miss? What were the games that you played that didn't make it onto my list? Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.